Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Perspectives, where we take a look at current events through the lens of American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is focused on sending troops to the southern border. President Donald Trump recently deployed several thousand U.S. soldiers to the southern border to enforce the immigration laws, also prevent illegal drugs from coming into the country. The United States has kind of a rich history of sending troops to the southern border. In our last episode, we focused on the activities associated with that from the 19th century. This episode, part 2, is going to focus on the 20th century, recognizing, again, my journey through American history, through the presidents, is from Washington through Eisenhower, so up until the 1950s these days, so we're going to focus primarily on the first half of the 20th century. All right, let's head to 1911. This is a period in which Mexico is going through another round of instability. There's widespread disorder. There's some violent riots. In fact, beginning a revolutionary cycle in Mexico. Really protests right now over the government of Porfirio Diaz, kind of spurred on by his rival, Francisco Madero, who is currently in exile in the United States in San Antonio, Texas. There's instability on the border, and President William Taft, the United States President William Taft, decided to dispatch 20,000 troops to the southern border just in case there might be a spillover effect of some of the violence going on in Mexico. People wanted to know, was he planning to intervene and send those troops into Mexico itself? According to Taft, well, the assumption by the press that I contemplate intervention on Mexican soil to protect American lives or property is, of course, gratuitous, because I seriously doubt whether I have such authority under any circumstances, and if I had, I would not exercise it without congressional approval. Well, Taft did have concern about the 40,000 Americans who were actually living in Mexico at the time. He was nervous that if he sent troops into Mexico to try to stop this instability, it would actually cause more problems for the Americans living there. His decision, not going to send in troops. Well, the Diaz government actually fell not that long after this. Madero returned to Mexico. He was elected, and the revolutionary activity continued. Madero was arrested not that long after. He was assassinated in February of 1913. All of this occurring at the end of the Taft administration, just about a month before Woodrow Wilson would become the next president of the United States. General Victoriano Huerta had led the coup against Madero, but it turned out he had a little bit of help. The U.S. ambassador to Mexico, Henry Wilson, was implicated in that coup, and the new president, Woodrow Wilson, was appalled by this. He immediately recalled Ambassador Wilson from Mexico, but he wasn't happy with General Huerta either. Look, according to Wilson, this was not the representative of the Mexican people. This was a result of a military coup. In fact, he publicly encouraged Huerta to step down from his authority and hold elections for the American people. Huerta said no. In fact, it was a strong no, and the people in Mexico actually supported Huerta for standing up to the American president. Well, about a year later, the next activity occurred. This is April of 1914, and the USS Dolphin, an American battleship, is in the port town of Tampico in Mexico. Just an ordinary visit, picking up supplies, and some American sailors were actually found to maybe they didn't have the right papers, and some Mexican soldiers arrested them. They detained them downtown before some of their superiors, and the Mexican army said, you know what, this might not be a very good idea to hold American sailors. They let them go. The Huerta government actually issued an apology, but that was not good enough. Not good enough for Admiral Henry Mayo, who had in charge of this part of the region for the U.S. Navy. He said, I want a 21-gun salute, a formal apology, militarily speaking, from the Mexicans, and for that, Huerta said no. Kind of point of pride, we've already apologized, we're not going to give you this 21-gun salute. Well, President Woodrow Wilson, stood by Admiral Mayo, and he waited for that 21-gun salute. 9 days, 10 days, 11 days, it wasn't coming, so Wilson decided to go to the U.S. Congress with a bit of a threat. He was warning that the armed forces of the United States might be used in such ways and to such an extent as may be necessary to obtain from General Huerta and his adherents the fullest recognition of the rights and dignity of the United States. Again, this was a point of pride, and Wilson was making it clear he wasn't going to just sort of sit back and wait. Well, the next day, there was a report that Wilson got. In fact, his cabinet called him in the middle of the night and said, we've heard that a shipment of 1,000 small arms are being sent from Germany to Mexico to the port city of Veracruz, and this was a concern. What did President Wilson want to do? Well, he immediately gave an order. Take Veracruz at once. Seize the custom house. Do not permit war supplies to be delivered to Huerta government or to any other part. The American military responded. They took the city of Veracruz. They took the custom house. They secured those arms, the small arms coming from Germany, which they did find. And it was not an easy battle, though. The Americans were triumphant in it, but it was a costly fight. 19 Americans were killed, another 70 were wounded, about 125 Mexicans were killed in the process. But now there's a calculus that obviously changed, and the pressure was on the Huerta government, because if the Americans controlled Veracruz, they could potentially control almost all of the commerce coming in and out of Mexico. This is the most important port in all of Mexico, and the Mexican people were starting to put some pressure on Huerta. He eventually gave up. He abdicated his authority in July of 1914. He went off to Spain. Tensions still high between the Americans and the Mexicans. Now, tensions in this part of the time, tensions high all over the world, particularly in Europe. World War I is underway. The Americans strictly neutral thus far. Woodrow Wilson trying to keep the Americans out of World War I. Mexico continued to be unstable in this period. In the wake of Huerta's leaving, two people emerged trying to take control of the country. Venustiano Carranza was one of them, and Pancho Villa was the other. The Americans and most of the rest of the world would recognize the Carranza government, but Villa wasn't happy about this, and he blamed the Americans for sort of not giving him his due, putting its thumb on the scale of another country. He didn't like it, and in 1916, on March the 9th, he took a band of about 1,500 marauders across the southern border into the United States, and they shot up the town of Columbus, New Mexico. 17 Americans were killed in this before American soldiers showed up to chase Villa back across the border. And the question was, what would Woodrow Wilson do to respond? His decision, send in troops, not just to the border, but across the border. He didn't go to Congress because he wasn't looking for a declaration of war. In his view, this was basically a police mission to go enforce American laws, to capture Villa, bring him back to the United States, and hold him to account for his recent actions. Well, General John Pershing was put in charge of this expedition. About 5,000 American soldiers went with him into Mexico, and for about 3 months they chased Villa all over the place. There was a few skirmishes here and there. The big fight took place in June at the Battle of Carrizal. It was another bloody battle on both sides. The Americans were victorious on the field of battle, but in essence, they again did not accomplish their mission because Villa was either nowhere to be found or he escaped. And at this point, President Wilson decided to cut his losses to end the manhunt. He told Colonel Edward House that the break seems to have come in Mexico and all my patience seems to have gone for nothing. I am infinitely sad about it, but he had other things to deal with. The United States entered World War I shortly after Wilson was reelected to the presidency, and after the Germans had decided to switch their strategy to one of unrestricted submarine warfare, put American ships at risk, just commercial vessels were at risk. This was the final straw, and the Americans under Wilson decided to come into the war and fight on behalf of the Allies. The Germans had another trick up their sleeve, not only switching to unrestricted submarine warfare, but to keep the Americans focused in North America, they decided to maybe see if they could get the Germans to come in on the side of the Central Powers and fight against the Americans. In January of 1917, a telegram was sent from the Secretary of Foreign Affairs for Germany, Arthur Zimmerman, to their ambassador to Mexico, in which he said that they proposed an alliance with Mexico on the following basis: that we shall make war together and together make peace. We shall give general financial support, and it is understood that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona, these being lands that the Americans had taken from the Mexicans as a result of the Mexican War in the previous century. Well, the British intercepted the famous Zimmerman note. It became public, and the Carranza government said, you know what, I'm not getting involved in this. Mexico, after all this publicity, said we're not going to get in common cause with the Germans. They would remain neutral as far as World War I is concerned. Well, our last engagement to cover here was in the case of an American president avoiding sending troops to the southern border, and this is now in 1925. So after World War I, Calvin Coolidge is now president of the United States, and Plutaro is the president of Mexico. And he decided to reclaim some foreign land, particularly oil land that had been sold in contracts to businesses from other countries. This was a point of pride for the Mexicans, and they wanted more of their oil revenue to stay in the country. But American companies, in particular oil companies, cried foul over this. And look, we did a legal purchase. These contracts are valid. You can't scientists sort of repudiate them, and they encourage the Coolidge administration to actually use military force to go enforce these contracts, and Coolidge simply balked. He said, now look on the other side of the picture. Here we are, the most powerful nation in the world. The world of today would harshly condemn us if, despite our attitude, we should go to war with a neighbor nation not nearly our equal. What do you suppose people in years to come would say? Powerful United States crushing powerless Mexico? Don't you think it is better for us to find another way to handle the situation? And he decided to have some new thinking, to call on an old friend to implement that new thinking. And it was a former colleague from his days at Amherst, Dwight, who he asked to become the new ambassador to Mexico to negotiate some kind of a solution. And his main guidance here to his friend Morrow: my only instructions are to keep us out of war with Mexico. Well, Morrow arrived in somewhat of a conciliatory mood. Again, his goal was to have an agreement here, but he was also pretty no-nonsense, very direct, and very productive negotiations with President Calles. Now, it called the Calles-Morrow Agreement, and what they eventually decided was to have a grandfather clause for any contracts that had been put into place prior to 1917. Those would stand. But the Mexicans would now retain the authority and the right to change or take back against contracts that had been written since that time. Now, not everybody was happy with this agreement, but it was a compromise, and by and large, the government certainly were very pleased. It was actually considered a pretty significant breakthrough in American and Mexican relations, and led to a period of stability for really at least the next couple of decades. Now, in 1938, things changed a little bit. A new Mexican president, Lazaro Cardenas, decided to nationalize the Mexican oil industry. This again created some instability and concern with American businesses, but again, this is 1938. President Franklin Roosevelt focusing a lot more on the instability in Europe at the time, with World War II burgeoning and likely to fall here within the near future. So no troops were deployed by Roosevelt associated with this change in the 1930s. Since then, it's really been about border security, immigration, and keeping illegal substances out of the United States. And it's not been the U.S. military, it's been the U.S. Border Patrol, which has gone through different name changes, but originally established in the United States in 1924. The United States had some new immigration laws relating to some pretty significant quota restrictions now on immigration from other parts of the world, and they deployed the new Border Patrol, both of the southern border and the northern border with Canada as well. And again, the goal: enforce the immigration laws, keep out illegal substances, particularly over time illegal drugs. And that's been primarily the role of border security going forward ever since. That is a look at part 2 of our 2-part episode here on sending troops to the southern border. We tracked it in the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century. For more on these stories, you can check out some of the links in the description below. We've got some additional episodes to share with you from Presidential Chronicles. Also, check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Perspectives from Presidential Chronicles.